I do regret when I stopped singing.
You stopped singing because of him?
Well, no, I worked less and less because evidently he did not like me to sing. If a person is in love, he does not want to see you on stage. That is comprehensible.
She was the most famous singer on the planet. She had millions in the bank, sold out stages across the world, and the love of the richest man alive. And she still died completely alone.
One hears that Mr. Onassis has been very kind in advising you financially, which has made you a very rich woman.
Sometimes you manage to make a decision at the right moment and it happens to go well.
But here is the part that will actually shock you. The one child she ever had lived for just 2 hours. She buried him by herself, in silence, while the father had already moved on. And when she died, every single penny she had ever earned went to people who had nothing to do with her life. Not one person who loved her got a thing. There are love stories that inspire, and then there are love stories that consume. The story of Maria Callas and Aristotle Onassis belongs firmly in the second category. It is a story about one of the most talented and celebrated women of the 20th century, and how her devotion to a man who was never truly hers ended up costing her nearly everything she had worked for. To understand how it all fell apart, you first have to understand who Maria Callas was before Onassis ever entered the picture. Maria Callas was born on December the 2nd, 1923, in New York City. Her parents were Greek immigrants who had made the journey to the United States in search of a better life. Her father, George Callas, was a pharmacist, and her mother, Evangelia, was a woman with strong ambitions for her children, particularly for Maria. From a very early age, it was clear that Maria had something unusual, a voice that did not belong to an ordinary child. Her mother recognized this and pushed her toward music with a determination that was, by most accounts, relentless. Maria's childhood was not especially easy or warm. Her parents' marriage was troubled, and there was tension in the household that followed her throughout her early years. Her mother favored her older sister Jackie, which left Maria feeling overlooked and, at times, unwanted. This sense of not being enough, of needing to prove herself, would follow Maria for the rest of her life and shape both her professional drive and her personal vulnerabilities. In 1937, when Maria was 13 years old, her mother made a decision that would change the trajectory of her daughter's life entirely. Evangelia took Maria and her sister back to Greece, leaving behind her husband and the life they had built in America. It was in Greece that Maria's musical education truly began in earnest. She studied at the Athens Conservatoire, under the instruction of the Spanish soprano Elvira de Hidalgo, who later described Maria as an exceptional student with a commitment and focus that far exceeded anyone else she had taught. De Hidalgo's influence on Maria was significant, helping to shape not only her vocal technique, but also her understanding of opera as a dramatic art form. The years Maria spent in Greece were formative, though they were also marked by hardship. During the Second World War, Athens was occupied, and like many people living through that period, Maria and her family faced genuine difficulties in terms of food and basic necessities. Despite these circumstances, she continued to study and perform, making her professional debut in 1941 with the Athens Opera. These early performances gave her valuable experience on stage, even if the audiences were modest compared to what was to come. Her career at an international level began to take shape after the war. In 1947, Maria Callas made a move that proved to be a turning point. She traveled to Verona, Italy, to perform the lead role in the opera La Gioconda. The performance drew significant attention, and the conductor Giovanni Battista Meneghini, who was present, was among those impressed. It was also in Verona that she came to the attention of the wider European opera world, which at that time was centered in Italy. Over the following years, Callas built a reputation that was without parallel in the world of opera. She performed at the most prestigious houses in the world, including La Scala in Milan and the Metropolitan Opera in New York. Critics and audiences consistently described her performances as something beyond the ordinary. What made her stand out was not just the technical quality of her voice, though that was remarkable in itself, but her ability to bring dramatic depth and emotional truth to the roles she performed. She had an instinct for character and storytelling that made her performances feel more like theatre than singing. Music historian and critic John Ardouin, who wrote extensively about her career, noted that she had an ability to convey the inner life of a character through her voice in a way that was almost unmatched in the history of recorded opera. Her standards were extremely high, and she made no apologies for that. She was selective about who she worked with and was known to be demanding in rehearsals and in her expectations of the people around her. She once said, in an interview that was widely reported at the time, that she had no interest in having her name associated with anything she considered to be second-rate. This attitude earned her a reputation as someone who was difficult, but it also earned her the respect of those who shared her commitment to quality. She was, by the time she reached her peak in the early to mid-1950s, widely considered to be the greatest soprano of her generation, and possibly of several generations. Away from the stage, however, there was a different side to Maria Callas. People who knew her personally described a woman who was deeply insecure beneath the confident exterior she presented to the world. She had a strong need for reassurance and approval, and she was genuinely moved by compliments, even when she may have suspected they were not entirely sincere. This need to be told she was exceptional, beautiful, and irreplaceable was a consistent thread throughout her life. Some who knew her believed it was rooted in her difficult childhood, in the years of feeling overlooked by her mother and of having to fight for recognition. She also carried with her a lasting fear of poverty. Having grown up in a household that was not wealthy and having experienced genuine hardship during the war years in Greece, the idea of losing financial security was something she never fully let go of. This fear contributed to her work ethic, which was formidable, but it also made her particularly vulnerable to people who could offer her the kind of stability and comfort she had spent her life reaching for. The man who first provided that stability was Giovanni Battista Meneghini. He was a wealthy Italian businessman and a devoted admirer of opera. When he met Maria in Verona in 1947, he was already in his mid-40s, considerably older than she was. He took a strong interest in her career and began acting as her manager and supporter, organizing her professional commitments and handling the many practical demands that came with her rapidly growing reputation. In 1949, they were married. By most accounts, the marriage was a stable and functional one, even if it was not a passionate love story in the conventional sense. Maria herself acknowledged in later years that her feelings for Giovanni were more like those of a daughter for a devoted father than those of a wife for a husband. He was protective of her, deeply loyal, and genuinely invested in her success. He kept the outside world at a manageable distance and allowed her to focus almost entirely on her work. For Maria, at that stage of her life, that arrangement suited her well. She was building something extraordinary, and Giovanni helped to make that possible. By the mid-1950s, Maria Callas was at the very top of her field. Her recordings were selling widely, her performances were selling out, and her name was known well beyond the world of classical music. She was a genuine cultural figure, the kind of artist whose reputation crossed over into the broader public consciousness. And yet, even at this peak, there were signs that things were beginning to shift. Her voice, while still extraordinary, was showing signs of strain. Her performances were becoming less frequent, and the relentless pressure she had placed on herself for over a decade was beginning to take a toll. It was at this point, when her career was starting to plateau, and the certainties of her professional life were less solid than they had once been, that a new and ultimately far more disruptive force entered her world. His name was Aristotle Onassis, and nothing would ever quite be the same again. Aristotle Onassis was not a man who went unnoticed. By the time he crossed paths with Maria Callas in the late 1950s, he was one of the wealthiest and most recognizable figures in the world. He had built his fortune from almost nothing, starting out as a young Greek immigrant in Argentina who had arrived with very little and managed, through a combination of sharp instincts, relentless ambition, and a willingness to take risks that others would not, to construct a business empire that spanned shipping, aviation, and beyond. By the mid-20th century, his name was synonymous with a particular kind of extravagant, unapologetic wealth that fascinated the public and the press in equal measure. He was born in 1906 in Smyrna, which is now the Turkish city of Izmir. His early life was marked by significant trauma. During the Greco-Turkish War in the early 1920s, his family was caught up in events that devastated the Greek community in the region, and he lost several family members during that period. He eventually made his way to Argentina as a teenager, where he began working and slowly building the foundations of what would become his extraordinary financial career. By the time he was in his 30s, he had already accumulated considerable wealth through tobacco trading and, most significantly, through shipping. He had an instinct for identifying opportunities that others overlooked, and he was not afraid to act on them decisively. By the 1950s, Onassis was operating on a scale that few individuals in the world could match. His fleet of tankers was one of the largest privately owned fleets in existence. He owned properties across Europe and beyond, and he moved through the highest social circles with a confidence and ease that suggested someone who had always belonged there, even though his wealth was entirely self-made. He was not conventionally handsome, but he had a powerful presence and a charm that people consistently remarked upon. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and made people take notice. His personal life was complicated, as the lives of enormously wealthy and powerful men often tend to be. In 1946, he married Athena Livanos, the daughter of a rival Greek shipping magnate named Stavros Livanos. Athena, known as Tina, was just 17 years old on the day of their wedding, while Onassis was nearly 40. The marriage was, in some respects, a merging of two powerful families within the tightly knit world of Greek shipping. Together they had 2 children. Their son Alexander was born in 1948, and their daughter Christina followed a couple of years later. Onassis adored his son and made little secret of the fact that he regarded Alexander as his heir and the future of his business empire. His relationship with Christina was reportedly more complicated, and those close to the family noted that he was never quite as warm toward her. The marriage to Tina was not a deeply romantic one by most accounts. Both parties were aware that Onassis spent a great deal of his time away from the family, consumed by business and by his own social appetites. There was reportedly an understanding between them that each would have a degree of personal freedom, though how explicit or mutual that arrangement truly was is something only they would have known. What is clear is that by the late 1950s, the marriage was not in good shape, and Onassis was very much a man who was looking, whether consciously or not, for something new. It was against this backdrop that he first met Maria Callas. The encounter took place at a party that had been organized in her honor sometime in the late 1950s. By several accounts, Onassis approached her with the kind of deliberate and focused attention that he typically brought to things he wanted. He kissed her hand and addressed her in Greek, telling her that she reminded him of a Greek goddess and that meeting her was a great honor. It was a polished and well-executed introduction, and it clearly made an impression. For Maria, who had a deep need to be admired and who had spent much of her adult life being valued primarily for her professional output rather than for herself as a woman, the attention of someone like Onassis was something quite different from what she was used to. From that initial meeting, Onassis began pursuing her with a consistency and enthusiasm that was hard to ignore. He made sure to appear wherever she was going to be, and he began sending her flowers, in quantities that went well beyond the gesture of ordinary admiration. Bouquets were delivered to wherever she was staying, to restaurants where she had lunch, and to her dressing rooms before performances. For a woman who valued being told she was extraordinary and unique, this kind of sustained and visible devotion was deeply appealing. The relationship moved into a new phase in the summer of 1959, when Onassis invited Maria and her husband Giovanni Battista Meneghini to join him on a cruise aboard his famous yacht, the Christina. The vessel was one of the most talked-about symbols of private luxury in the world at that time. Built originally as a Canadian frigate, it had been converted and refitted at enormous expense into a floating palace that stretched over 300 feet. It had been named after his daughter and was fitted with every luxury imaginable, including a swimming pool whose floor could be raised to create a dance floor, a bar with bar stools upholstered in the skin of a whale's tooth, and a crew of dozens. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary environment in which to spend 3 weeks. The guest list for the cruise was equally remarkable. Among those on board were Winston Churchill and his wife, along with a collection of wealthy and well-connected individuals from Britain, America, and Greece. For Maria, who had grown up in relatively modest circumstances and who had built her way to the top entirely through her talent and hard work, being in this world was intoxicating in its own way. The Mediterranean in summer aboard one of the most luxurious private vessels ever built, surrounded by some of the most prominent people alive at the time, was as far from the difficult years of her childhood as it was possible to imagine. Giovanni, her husband, had declined to come. His reasons were not entirely clear. though some accounts suggest that he had reservations about Onassis, or perhaps about the dynamics of the situation more broadly. Whatever his reasons, his absence left Maria on the cruise without the one person who had consistently acted as a kind of anchor and protector in her life. During those 3 weeks at sea, the relationship between Maria and Onassis moved from admiration into something considerably more serious. They spent a great deal of time together, and by most accounts, they were not particularly discreet about the fact that their interest in each other had become romantic. Onassis' wife Tina was on board and witnessed much of what was happening between them. For someone in her position, it must have been a deeply humiliating experience, and it planted the seeds of what would soon become the end of the Onassis marriage. For Maria, the experience was transformative in a way that few things in her life had been. She later spoke openly about how she had felt during that time, and her words gave a clear sense of what the cruise had meant to her. She described falling in love with a completeness and a lack of self-consciousness that she compared to being a teenager again. She was emphatic that it had nothing to do with his money, and she pointed out, not unreasonably, that she was herself a wealthy woman who had earned her own fortune. What she said she had found in Onassis was something she had not experienced before, the feeling of being wanted and valued, not as a professional asset or as a famous name, but simply as a woman. When the cruise ended and the passengers returned to their ordinary lives, the consequences of what had happened on board began to unfold quickly. Maria separated from Giovanni, and the two subsequently divorced. Onassis' marriage to Tina also came to an end, with Tina citing Onassis' involvement with Callas as part of the reason for the breakdown. The divorces attracted an enormous amount of press coverage, as was perhaps inevitable, given the public profiles of everyone involved. Maria and Onassis were now, to all appearances, free to pursue their relationship, openly. What followed should, in theory, have been the beginning of a happy chapter for Maria Callas. She was in love. She was with a man who seemed devoted to her, and she had allowed herself to believe that the future held the kind of personal happiness that her professional achievements had never quite managed to provide on their own. She had set aside her reservations, walked away from a stable marriage, and placed her trust entirely in a man who had pursued her with great persistence and apparent sincerity. What she could not yet see, or perhaps was not yet willing to see, was the nature of the man she had chosen to love. Aristotle Onassis was many things. He was brilliant, charming, generous in his way, and capable of making the people around him feel genuinely special. But he was also a man who had spent his entire life getting exactly what he wanted, and who had very rarely had to reckon with the cost of that to the people around him. The pursuit was something he was very good. That's it. What came after the pursuit was a different matter entirely. In the months that followed the cruise and the divorces, Maria Callas and Aristotle Onassis became one of the most talked about couples in the world. Wherever they went, the press followed. They were photographed together at restaurants in Paris and Monte Carlo, on the deck of the Christina, and at social gatherings across Europe. For a time, it looked from the outside like a genuine love story between two larger-than-life figures who had found each other at the right moment. The reality, as it gradually became clear, was considerably more complicated than that. Maria had walked away from her marriage to Giovanni Battista Meneghini with a completeness that surprised many people who knew her. Giovanni had been her manager, her protector, and her most consistent supporter for over a decade. He had organized her professional life, shielded her from unwanted distractions, and dedicated himself to her success in a way that few people could or would have done. For all his limitations as a romantic partner, he had given her stability and genuine devotion. When the marriage ended, Maria lost not only a husband, but an entire infrastructure of support that she had come to rely on, perhaps more than she had realized. In its place, she had Onassis, and for a while at least, that seemed like enough. He was attentive and generous, and he continued to treat her with the kind of focused admiration that had captivated her from the beginning. He gave her expensive gifts, took her on the yacht, and introduced her to his world of extraordinary privilege and social connection. For Maria, who had spent the better part of her adult life living inside the demanding and often isolating bubble of a performing career, this new existence offered something genuinely different. But there was a cost that she was slow to acknowledge. Her career, which had been the central pillar of her identity and her sense of self-worth for as long as she could remember, began to suffer almost immediately. The opera houses and concert promoters who had been eager to work with her found that she was increasingly unavailable or uninterested. Offers came in from the most prestigious venues in the world, and she turned them down or simply failed to respond. The discipline and total commitment to her art that had defined her professional life for 2 decades began to loosen and then to unravel. Those who had worked closely with her and who understood what her career represented found this difficult to watch. She had sacrificed an enormous amount to reach the position she occupied in the world of opera. Her voice was not a gift that had come without effort. It had been developed through years of intensive study and relentless practice, and maintaining it at the level her reputation demanded required a kind of ongoing physical and mental dedication that left very little room for anything else. When she chose Onassis over that dedication, she was not simply taking a break from work. She was dismantling something that could not easily be rebuilt. By the early 1960s, the effects of this were becoming audible. Critics and audiences who attended her increasingly rare performances began to notice that her voice was not what it had been. The extraordinary control and range that had made her the most discussed soprano of her era were diminishing. There were performances where she struggled in ways that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier. In 1965, during a performance in Paris, she was unable to finish her aria. For someone who had built her entire identity around the perfection and power of her voice, this was a deeply painful moment, and it effectively marked the end of her career as a performing opera singer. After that, she gave only occasional solo concerts, a significant step down from the operatic roles that had made her name. The stage, which had been her natural home for her entire adult life, was no longer somewhere she could go. Meanwhile, her relationship with Onassis was revealing itself to be something quite different from what she had hoped for. The man who had pursued her so persistently and showered her with attention and flowers was, it turned out, someone whose interest was not easily sustained. As the initial intensity of the romance settled into something more everyday, Onassis began to behave in ways that caused Maria considerable pain. He was frequently absent. His business interests took him around the world, and he spent a great deal of time away from her. He had always been a man who moved at his own pace and according to his own priorities, and those priorities did not always include Maria. She would go for weeks without hearing from him, waiting in the apartments and houses that were part of his property portfolio, hoping for a phone call that often did not come. When she tried to reach him, he would not always respond. For a woman who had a deep need for reassurance and who had already made herself enormously vulnerable by giving up so much for this relationship, these silences were genuinely distressing. And then, after a long absence, he would reappear. He would send an extravagant bouquet of flowers, perhaps accompanied by an expensive piece of jewelry, and he would arrive full of warmth and charm and apparent devotion. Maria, who loved him with a consistency and depth that those around her found remarkable and sometimes difficult to understand, would forgive everything. The reunion would feel, she later said, like the beginning of the relationship all over again, as though none of the hurt and waiting had happened. This cycle of absence, silence, and reconciliation repeated itself many times over the years they were together. There were promises too, the kind of promises that a certain type of person makes when they want to restore goodwill without any real intention of following through. On one occasion, Onassis told Maria that he was going to buy a castle in France where they would live together. It was exactly the kind of gesture that would have meant a great deal to her, a concrete commitment to a shared future, a home that would be theirs. She was genuinely excited about it. The castle was subsequently purchased, but not by Onassis and not for Maria. He had apparently moved on to other things and gave no indication of remembering the promise he had made. When people around Maria raised the subject, the billionaire's response suggested it had barely registered as something significant in his mind. People who were close to Maria during these years have described watching her navigate this relationship with a mixture of sadness and disbelief. The woman who had once carried herself across the stages of the world's greatest opera houses with the absolute certainty of someone who knew their own worth was now waiting by the telephone and making excuses for a man who treated her needs as secondary to his own. Comfort and convenience. Her friends found it difficult to raise their concerns directly because her response to any criticism of Onassis was fierce and immediate. She did not want to hear it. She was in love. And the love she felt for him seemed to operate independently of the evidence that was accumulating around her. Onassis, for his part, was not spending all of his time alone during his absences from Maria. His name was connected to other women on various occasions, and the press, which had always paid close attention to his movements, reported on this. Maria was aware of it, but she found ways to minimize what it meant, or to hope that it would pass. She had invested too much, emotionally and practically, to be able to look at the situation clearly. The most devastating episode of the entire relationship came when Maria became pregnant. For her, the prospect of having a child with the man she loved was something she had wanted deeply. She was in her mid-30s by this point, and the idea of becoming a mother had become increasingly important to her. When the pregnancy happened, she would have had every reason to hope that it might bring them closer together and perhaps finally provide the commitment from Onassis that she had been waiting for. His reaction was the opposite of what she had hoped for. According to accounts from people who knew the situation, Onassis made clear that he was not pleased about the pregnancy. Rather than stepping closer to Maria at a moment when she needed support, he stepped away. He left, and she was largely alone to deal with what followed. The pregnancy ended in tragedy. Their son, who was given the name Omero, or Homer, was born prematurely and survived for only a matter of hours before he died. Maria buried him in a cemetery in Milan, and she did so alone. She continued to visit his grave for the rest of her life. The grief of losing a child is something that is difficult to put into words under any circumstances. To lose a child while effectively alone without the presence or support of the man responsible, and in the context of a relationship that had already caused so much pain, was a blow from which Maria Callas never truly recovered. Those who knew her in the period following her son's death describe a woman who was fundamentally altered. The resilience and drive that had carried her through so many difficulties earlier in her life seemed to have diminished in a way that was permanent. Her voice, which had already been weakening, deteriorated further under the weight of the stress and grief she was carrying. The 1965 performance in Paris, where she could not complete her aria, came not long after this period, and it is hard to separate the physical decline from the emotional circumstances that surrounded it. The body and the voice that had once seemed capable of almost anything had reached their limit. Her career as one of the world's great opera singers was over. What remained was the question of what came next for a woman who had lost her career, lost her child, and was still tied to a man who had shown her, repeatedly and unmistakably, that he was not capable of giving her what she needed. The answer, as the next chapter of her life would show, was that things were not yet finished, getting worse. By the mid-1960s, Maria Callas was living a life that bore almost no resemblance to the one she had built for herself. The stages were gone, the performances were over, and the career that had defined her since childhood had come to an end. Onassis had bought her an apartment in Paris, where she spent much of her time in a quiet, isolated existence, neither fully part of his world nor free from it. Then, in 1968, came the news that changed everything. Onassis announced that he was going to marry Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of the assassinated American president. For Maria, the impact was devastating. She had waited 8 years for her own divorce to be finalized, giving up her marriage and career in the expectation that Onassis would eventually commit to her. When she first confronted him, he denied it, insisting that his feelings for her had not changed. He was lying. The wedding went ahead in October 1968, and Maria had a breakdown in the period that followed. She stopped going out, stopped engaging with the world, and began relying on sedatives to get through her days. What came next seemed to confirm the old Greek belief that certain kinds of fortune carry a curse. In 1973, Onassis's beloved son Alexander was critically injured in an aviation accident and never regained consciousness. His father made the decision to turn off the life support. Onassis never recovered from the loss. His first wife Tina died the following year at the age of 45. Onassis himself was diagnosed with a serious neuromuscular disease and deteriorated rapidly. He died on March 15, 1975, at the age of 69. Maria had been brought to his bedside once, quietly, by his sister, during a moment when Jacqueline was absent. He was unconscious. It was a farewell that only one of them was present for. The years that followed were defined by grief and loneliness. She lived quietly in her Paris apartment, deeply unhappy, and by most accounts she turned to medication and other substances to manage the depression that had settled over her life. On September 16, 1977, she was found dead in her apartment at the age of 53. The official cause was a heart attack. Her ashes were scattered around the island of Skorpios, where Onassis was buried, fulfilling a promise she had once made to him that she would never truly leave him.